Jason, I'm going to try something.
Yeah?
I'm going to pull it out there.
Okay.
Just to see if it goes.
Get ready. Yes. Pretty well. We had one at one point, but we're going to have to rebuild the door before the year's over. Everybody likes sitting close this morning, don't you? Don't mind being a little crowded. Okay, as always, how many of y'all are here for the first time? Okay, how many first time have you ever been in the nursery? Okay. Well, we want to welcome everybody. Everybody know Bruce Deuley? I'm sure you probably will know his voice when he starts talking, but one of the good people in the world of organics and the world of environmental affairs. If you don't listen to him on Saturday afternoons on KTSA, you need to make it a point to do so. Very interesting. 5 until 7 in the afternoons. And thank you for coming this morning.
Well, thank you.
Oh my gosh, we're going to get it from two directions this morning.
Yeah, you'll get cracked because Jason's here.
There we go. Oh, the topic this morning is compost tea. And Bruce is one of the authorities on compost tea. He's worked with Dr. Lane Ingham, who is sort of the world guru on compost tea. And Roberta and I have had the pleasure of attending her seminars as well. So I think what we'll do this morning is just kind of throw it back and forth. I want to talk a little bit about what compost tea is, how compost tea is made, how compost tea is used. Maybe next time we do this, we'll have a microscope set up with a big TV screen, which is what we wanted to do. So as you can see cute little guys like this is what we look at through our microscope every week when we make compost tea, and then check it before we start selling it. But in a nutshell, and jump in anytime you want to.
Just listen, I want to mention that we show these microscope pictures, and I have a microscope, and but you can make perfectly good teas at home for the most part, and you don't have to have $1,000 worth of equipment. Matter of fact, you can make it for $30.
And did you bring a tea bucket?
I have to look in the car and see. I did bring a bunch of books and everything.
Okay, we'll get some we'll get that in a few minutes.
Something.
There are a number of misconceptions about compost tea, so wanted to start out just a minute telling you exactly what compost tea is, and in effect what it's used for and why it's important that you use it. Compost tea is a brewed material. It is not the same as compost leachate. If you just put compost in a bucket, put water in it, let it sit for a while, and then pour the liquid off, that's what some people think of as compost tea, but that's not really what we're talking about here. That would be what we would call compost leachate, which is literally just the different things that have leached out of the compost. Those things will have basically two kinds of material in them. They will have a mineral material in there, and probably a little bit of what we might call fertilizer type things, nitrates, phosphates, things like that. But the most important thing is the life that is in there. And this microbial life takes on a lot of different forms. It may be bacterial, it may be fungal, it may involve what we call protozoans, it may contain things like beneficial nematodes, but the life that is in there is what we are going to take and enhance, so to speak, to make compost tea. Actually, we won't use the full name every time, but when we speak of compost tea, we're actually talking about something called actively aerated compost tea. And the idea behind making this AACT, if you will, is to first of all break loose or leach out. We actually do it through the action of air bubbles and things like that. Break loose from the compost the kinds of things that we want to have in the tea, the bacteria, the fungi, and the other things we were talking about, and then treat them in such a way that they can multiply themselves many times over. There's a real orgy going on in that bubbling water, inside of your tea brewer. Now, some things reproduce very quickly. Bacteria, like a 12-minute generation time or something like that?
Depending on the temperature.
Yeah, they can double themselves. I think that's what we would call a geometric progression. If you think rabbits multiply quickly, they got nothing on bacteria. Fungi are much slower to reproduce themselves. In fact, the generation time in fungal things can vary from, you know, a lot of hours to a lot of days. Nematodes is even longer. Protozoans, it may be very short, it may be very long. But in the tea brewing process, we're basically doing three things. We are bringing the microbes loose from the compost. We are putting materials in the liquid broth, so to speak, that will stimulate their growth and reproduction. And then we're bubbling a lot of oxygen through it to make sure that they have everything they need to stay alive and to reproduce. When we are growing microbes, so to speak, with lots of oxygen, we refer to this as an aerobic process. And what we want is aerobic things. Aerobic things tend to be very good for the soil, tend to be very good in general. If we don't have the oxygen going through fast enough, or if we let the compost tea stand for too long after it's brewed with no oxygen source, or if we put in so many stimulants that they reproduce faster than we can keep oxygen in the water, then we move into what we call an anaerobic state. This is most easily identified because it stinks. Good compost tea should have kind of a fresh, earthy smell to it. If it smells bad, and Elaine taught us all these fancy words at one time, putrescine and all
that's
these,
vomit.
yeah, if it's all these different things that smell really bad, you know you've got bad stuff, and that's not what we want. Most all of the aerobic microbes are good things to have and pose no threat to you whatsoever. Anaerobic bacteria in particular may be facultative, which means they may or may not, or they can live both aerobic and anaerobic, or they may be true anaerobic bacteria. This includes fun little things like botulism and the bad form of E. coli, yeah, and bad things. So we always want to have lots of good air movement. We don't want to overdo it with the stimulants that we put in there. And when you get compost tea, whether you make it yourself or whether you're out, you know, buying it from somebody that's brewing it, use it quickly. We normally figure that we would like to see you put that compost tea out within about 2 hours of the time that you get it. Now, the guy that drives says, I've, you know, spent me 3 hours driving up here to get it. Get one of those little aerated minnow buckets, or something like that.
The little pumps are $7 at Walmart, and it really will help you. They're battery operated. We use them to take for fish bait.
Yeah.
Works very well.
And you just put a tube and an air stone down in your jar or in your bucket, whatever. Barring that, you can do sort of a low-tech method to try to keep some oxygen in there. You do this a lot. Now, if you're driving on Sunset Road, just drive back and forth. This stuff will stay aerated for as long as you want to keep it going out there.
Supercharged. Let me bring up a couple things. I just happened to get Howard Garrett is a guy that most of you I know through Bob, if you don't know him. He did get his, once a year he puts out all of his formula book. It's out now. But don't do what he said. The one thing he hasn't changed is he's filling the bucket with 3/4 full of manure. He's putting water in and letting it sit 14 days, and he's telling you that that's the healthiest way to do this. We'll get it corrected, I promise. He just doesn't know it's in there. I had a woman call me, my oldest books, before I went to any of this, had the same kind of thing, because that's what we were told. And indeed, you're making a leachate, but if you let it sit 14 days, what Elaine says is if you go long enough, it may get aerobic again. But in between, you go very anaerobic, and you really make a mess for yourself.
And it'd be a good weed killer.
Oh,
you know, it really seriously will kill a lot of stuff that you put it on. And it's kind of like some of the old-fashioned chemical insecticides. I'm never sure whether they really kill the insects or whether the insects committed suicide because it smells so bad. But yeah, you do not want anaerobic tea. You want lots and lots and lots of oxygen.
In a little 5-gallon bucket, you want a pound or pound and a half of good composted material. You're not trying to knock everybody out of that compost. It is an inoculant. It is not, when they think about putting 3/4 manure, they're trying to get all the bugs from there. All you want is the inoculant in there, then you want to feed them and aerate them at the right temperatures, and you will get your bugs. You'll get multiplications of bugs. You don't have to have that much material. That was one thing that's changed a lot, even since we first started. The 55 gallons now are taking a lot less material than they used to. They've cut back, and they're still getting as good a teas. So remember, it's an inoculant. It is not how much from this piece of manure or this composted material. Does that make sense?
Now, bacteria and fungi both can be pretty specific in what they break down, what they decompose, what they live on. They are also very temperature sensitive as to their activity. As little as it's 2 degrees centigrade, let's say 5 degrees temperature shift in the liquid that they're in can activate new forms, can deactivate old forms. So you want your compost tea to be pretty close to the ambient temperature when you put it out. I mean, don't make it in a super warm garage and then come out and spray it on a super cold day. You're not going to hurt anything, but you're not really going to get all the benefits that you might from it. We always brew our tea in an outdoor area. Our tea's been brewing since, early yesterday morning, because pretty much what they found, the ideal time for the greatest diversity of microbial life is, what do we still say, 24 to 72 hours?
Yeah, 24 to 78 maybe, but I don't know, I go 36 hours, seems pretty good, unless you've got a awful, some of the machines that roil the water instead of actually aerate it take longer. There's a couple of them that laminate the water, and it takes a little longer.
If it looks like a choppy sea, you've got too much movement in there. If it looks like a pot sitting on the stove with just a light boil with lots of air bubbles going through it, that's what we're really looking for. Now, how many different kinds of microbes are you going to have? That's going to depend on how good the compost that you started with was. And people always, ask what makes a really good compost. My answer, and I'll let Bruce give you what he thinks, but my answer is the more different things that went into making the compost, the better the compost is going to be. It's why I'm not crazy about what I call single source compost products like cotton burr compost. What you're going to get in that is basically the bugs, as Bruce calls them, that break down cotton burrs. What is a really good compost? Well, a bulk compost, my favorite, is still the stuff they make out at New Earth, because they put about 20 different feedstocks in there. I mean, everything from paunch manure from the slaughterhouse to, 10 different kinds of old ice cream, and just basically anything organic, anything that was once alive will break down and make compost. I do not care to put any biosolids material into my compost. Manures I have no problem with, fish hydrolysate, and I'll let Bruce tell you a little bit about all the different things we put in to stimulate. But I would like to see us using a compost that is made from the largest number of feedstocks possible, because that's going to give us the greatest number of different kinds of microbes in there. If you're buying compost in a bag, I still think Drumgool's Revitalizer compost is probably the best. But I always worry about bagged products, because you don't know if they've been sitting on a pallet for 3 weeks, sitting out in the hot sun with a plastic cover over the top of them, which is going to knock down a lot of the diversity that's in there. Now, how much diversity is in there? Oh, I think they say that with really good healthy compost, in a big tablespoon of compost, you could have 10,000 different kinds of bacteria. And you could have millions of each kind. But 10,000 different kinds of bacteria, 5,000 different kinds of fungi, and who knows how many protozoans and other things. There is a tremendous amount of life underneath there. If you come sometime when we do have a microscope set up, you put like 1 drop of liquid on a microscope slide, and when you narrow that down, you're probably looking at 1/10,000th of that slide. And yet, if your eyes were good enough to count, you'd probably count 5,000 little bacteria, doing this all underneath there. It's just incredible the number of microbes that you are getting in your compost tea. Now, before we talk about the brewing process, why would you want to use compost tea? Well, I think that, that the health of plants depends more than anything else on the diversity of microbial life in the soil. The structure of your soil, whether it's hard pan to where no water soaks in, or whether it's nice and open where you get plenty of oxygen when it takes up the rainfall when it comes down, that is largely due not so much to the structure of the soil, but due to the microbial life that is in there. They do something that we call flocculating the soil. And the greatest source of organic material in the soil, everybody thinks it's something you can see, thinks it's compost you mixed in and dead roots and things like that. The greatest builders of organic material in the soil are bacteria, things that you can't see at all.
Let me say a little bit about, before we go off the compost. I still think personally that the best compost in the world is one you make on your property. If you'll put your diversity in there, I use plants that I've grown, the kind of plants I want. I actually have my own wood pile, so I've got a fungal source of my own from right where I am.
He has his own buzzard, so
I
you
have
know
my
what
own
you're going to
vulture.
get. You know, a buzzard in there. I hate to think about that.
She drags up things that I can throw in there. But I really do. I use my own as much as possible. There are great other compost out there, but as years go by and you build up this, what I want on my property, I find it more and more important that I use my products. One thing that we didn't bring up is some great compost, but I really do think that worm castings are a real benefit. If they're good worm castings that haven't been overheated, that haven't been abused, they're one of the magic things to be added to your basic compost. But look for your own local stuff first. I take some of the plants out of my garden, I take some of my own weeds, of course all my own, those of you who don't know, I don't even own a septic system. I have my own composting toilet. So I have everything goes back for a use. And it's good to have it off your property. It really is. You can build your own, if you've got a little corner to do it, get your compost pile done, make yourself some really, really good. If you need extra, you don't have enough, go get a revitalizer, or what do you say, New Earth?
New Earth.
I think he just bought a guy in, we talked about that.
Conroe, yeah.
Bought a guy in Conroe that was, according to Elaine Ingham at that day, 2 years ago, we did the show or three, had the best compost she had ever tested to make tea out of, and now they own that formula and everything. So it's probably going to be a pretty good compost to use.
But when would you want to use compost tea? Well, if your soil has been chemically treated with fertilizers and or pesticides of any sort, you have killed out an awful lot of life in the soil. If your soil has been repeatedly fertilized with chemical fertilizers, you have burned a lot of the organic material out of the soil, and that organic material is what the microbes rely on to live. That's their energy source. The way bacteria and fungi create the energy that they need to live is by breaking carbon bonds in the organic material in the soil. In the Rio Grande Valley, for instance, 60 years ago, the soils down there were 4.5 to 6.5% organic material. Today they are less than 1/2%. And all of our yards for years, all of us, me included, put chemical fertilizer on our yard because we didn't know any different. Bruce might not have, he's smarter than I am and he's been doing it longer.
Too lazy.
We've done a lot of things to kill off the good life in the soil. We tend to grow plants that have been raised in very sterile situations, and we're finding that healthy plants, the roots are covered several layers deep with beneficial bacteria. The leaves and stems are covered several layers deep with beneficial bacteria and beneficial fungi. But according the gospel according to A&M and the Extension Service and everything else says spray everything you can find, kill everything you can find. And by the way, if you really want to create an unhealthy condition, keep washing your hands with that antibacterial soap. You're killing off all those beneficial microbes that are on your skin protecting you. And a lot of the sickest people out there, and the people with the biggest skin problems, are the ones that have killed off all the natural life that's living on your skin. And that's in effect what we do with our plants and what we do with the environment that we live in.
There's a great study of kids that are raised with pets. The percentage of asthmas and other things they get are way lower than those that are kept sterile. They call it the hygiene theory. Your kid ought to eat a little dirt once in a while. Ought to sleep on the dog once in a while. I mean, it really is healthier for them down the road when they start intermingling with other kids, starting to school. There's some good studies that show that it really is healthy. Sterilization is not necessarily, people that drink sterilized and pasteurized milk, they're finding out there's a lot of better things in whole milk, except the government don't want us to have it.
You hear 2 hours of that, 5 o'clock this afternoon. Seriously, this is what he talks about on his show. So he doesn't do nearly, I'm not criticizing at all. But Bruce doesn't do the call-ins the way that I do. He does more prepared, material from his great research, and you will find a lot of very interesting things there. But other reasons that we use compost teas on things, I don't care what kind of fertilizer you're using, whether it's a fertilizer or whether it's organic. Well, I do care. I want you only to use organic. But whatever kind of material you're using, that fertilizer cannot be processed and used by plants until it's acted upon by the microbes in the soil. And if you have very poor soil, organic material comes with some of its own built-in microbes, but the healthier soil is, the better you will get the better results you will get from the fertilizer that you put on. The recycling of nutrients in the soil. Dr. Elaine Ingham, that we refer to, is a former professor of microbiology at the University of Oregon. She now has her own business called the Soil Food Web with offices on 5 continents or something like that. The lady's pretty darn sharp. But she made the comment that as long as you are not taking anything away, if you're not being a hay grower that cuts and bales his hay and hauls it off, or a vegetable grower that takes all the vegetables and takes all the waste and takes it away, or a less informed homeowner who rakes all the leaves off their yard every year, if you're letting things return to the soil, she says that if you fertilize once and have good microbial life, that fertilizer should last you for 100 years before you have to fertilize again. That seems pretty hard to believe. But the point is that when you have a lot of good life working in your soil, whether it's cropland or there's your yard, you're recycling all this material so well and you're getting so much better benefit from the minerals that are in there. I think it was at conference in Mesquite that she showed us pictures. Everybody know what pivot irrigation is, those big round circles? You're flying over West Texas and you see all those little round green dots down there, some of them like a half a pie, things like that. Well, she showed us a picture of one of these pivot irrigators in Australia where they had sprayed half of it with compost tea and they had not sprayed the other half. And same fertilizer, same everything else. But the half that they sprayed with compost tea was a solid green mass. The other half that had not been sprayed was probably 40% bare dirt and 60% plants. She made the comment, she said, I would love to tell you what the difference in production from the 2 halves of this pivot were, but she said I can't do that because we took and showed the picture to the rancher or farmer. So what did you do? And I sprayed the other half with compost tea. He said the whole thing looked very good. But it is amazing the way that you increase the efficiency of the nutrient material that you put out, whether it's micronutrients you spray on or pour on, whether it's your basic fertilizer that you're putting on in one form or another. Compost tea will make all of that work better. Ken Graff, the man who has the corn maze over in Hondo. I don't know how many of y'all have been over to see that. Ken told me he hadn't fertilized his corn in something like 10 years.
Yeah, last time I told him, I didn't even know for sure.
Yeah, and yet his corn, is almost as tall as the roof of this building. It's taller than the tractor. He said this year, with all the rain this past year, he couldn't see where he was going because the corn was taller than the tractor. And that's without any fertilizer. But he uses compost tea materials on a very regular basis to recycle the nutrients that are out there.
He leaves his stocks in place. He doesn't take his organic material away. That gives him probably 60% of everything he needs right there. It's there.
I was talking to a gentleman from the valley that was up doing some consulting in, I think up in wheat country or corn country somewhere. And the fellow said, I want to take you out and show you the fields that we treated with a compost tea materials and the ones that we didn't. And he said they drove out, and Kay said he looked out and said, you treated that field and that field and that field, didn't you? And said the guy looked at him kind of amazed, because this was midwinter, and said, how did you know that? And he said, look where the snow is. He says, there's no snow on those 3 fields. That's because you've got so much decomposing, so much biological activity going on. You've created the heat that's melted the snow, put the moisture in the ground where it needs to be, and the soil is that much better off. So there are a lot of reasons to do it. One other reason that I'll tell you before we move on, or till Bruce adds what he wants to, is that another benefit of spraying compost tea on plants is that in many cases you kind of crowd out the bad guys. And this is something Elaine taught us, especially with fungus diseases, that there are only so many sites on, say, the leaf of a plant where a fungus can take root, if you will, and grow actively. And if all those sites are occupied by beneficial fungi, then the bad guys can't get started. And spraying compost tea on greatly increases the amount of good guys, kind of like spraying with garlic and other things that stimulate good fungi. Another very interesting point that she made, and we don't even know the way that a lot of these things work, but she told us about one of her employees, and I don't even remember where it was, maybe in New Mexico, where they were treating some sort of foliage disease on a bunch of trees, and she had a fellow that worked for her that had come back from Vietnam with some horrible skin malady that every summer when it got hot, his skin literally started rotting away. Said he literally had to wear long sleeves and things like that because nobody could stand to look at him. It looked like leprosy or something like that. And the doctors have been able to do nothing about this. Just every summer he lost a lot of his skin, and you know, just terrible, terrible situation. Well, he was the guy that got the job of going out there with that big spray rig, spraying all this stuff over the foliage of these cottonwood trees that were having a problem. And of course, you know, he was dousing himself with the compost tea in the process. She said after about a month of this, his skin condition cleared up completely and never came back. So there's a lot of good stuff in compost tea, and there are a lot of reasons to use it. Are there other specific things you want to add about it?
Well, it is. She doesn't like to use the word pesticide. It is not. But like you said, they do. I use it this way, especially for kids when I tell them, if you have a bunch of condos where you got layer and layers of people living, and every condominium is full, there's nowhere for anybody to move in. So you keep the riffraff out. and that's exactly what you're doing when you really get this plant back where it ought to be. There's nowhere for them to go. The bad guys can't get in because the house is full. And that's kind of a simple way to look at it. It kind of makes sense that the plant's healthy as it can be. We know that plants that are healthy, that have a full battery of microbes, also give us more health. You know, you can raise something on Miracle Grow and spray it to keep all the bugs off, and the plant doesn't have to do anything to protect itself. It's also not producing any phytochemicals or anything to protect you. That's where those flavonoids come from, is when that plant goes into a little stress, it goes to protect itself, and it does it pretty quick. Bugs know it does. Bacteria is part of how that works. That's part of the whole big picture. And then if it doesn't have it, it can't do that.
It'll be a whole nother seminar, but along that line, you know, you've always heard plants don't have immune systems, only animals have immune systems. We're finding that that's just not the case. That plants that are challenged one way or another by these bad guys that Bruce was talking about initiate an immune type response. Now granted, it's not the same as it is in a warm-blooded organism, and we don't really know exactly how it works. But we do know that plants that are challenged in these ways tend to really develop things that help them really fight off a lot of different insect and diseases that may hit them. There's now a product out on the market called Messenger. It's something that contains something called harpin protein, which is basically a protein that's derived from the bugs, fungi and insects and things like that that attack plants. They derived this, John Dromgool's first guy that told us about this, an actual gardener up in Austin, and sprayed on plants. Don't know exactly how it works, but it certainly seems to make them more resistant to both insects and disease. And like you were talking about making produce, it also seems to really increase production both of flowers and fruit. I didn't use it last year, got it too late in the season, but talked to 2 or 3 people that did that really reported interesting results, good results. I'll be using some of it in my garden, and if it's something you want to play with, you need to get one of these little packages of it and try it. It doesn't really have much to do with compost tea, but I'm sure in some ways some of the response is the same, and I'm sure they would work pretty well together. For those of y'all that haven't been here, if you have a question, it's something that we haven't covered adequately as we go along, or if we've misspoken or something we said just doesn't make sense, please stick up your hand and make us stop and repeat it. If it's something we're going to cover a little bit later, we'll put you off for a few minutes. And I think most of y'all know how the game goes. If you don't want to admit that you've done something in your own yard, you say, my neighbor couldn't come, but they wanted me to ask you this. And, or make it up, your kid or whatever else.
Whoever put that sheet together for you, that is a good, there's a lot of knowledge on one page.
Going back to when you purchased your compost, how long can I keep that?
Keep a little moisture in it, you can keep it for 10 years probably.
And don't sit it in the sun.
Yeah.
Those bags, when I was running Garden Bill, I think we took one of the compost thermometers one day, it was 3 foot, and it was 150 some degrees in a plastic bag sitting in the sun. Well, at about 135, that's what we bring compost up to kill microbes.
Yeah.
And so at 150, that thing's basically getting sterilized. So you see them out, and I don't want to pick on everybody because there's so many people that don't have places to put this, a lot of the nurseries. But you're really, it's really not as good as stuff. If it's been out there in July, sitting in the sun for 2 weeks, you can probably eat it. It's probably so sterile it wouldn't even hurt.
Not enough to make it muddy, but just enough that you can feel some moisture in it, that it doesn't feel powder dry.
Damp sponge.
Yeah. One thing about microbes too, if you let them get too dry, or in some cases too hot or too cold or whatever, about half the microbes have a dormant or resting phase. And if you let it get too dry, you're just going to shove a lot of them into a dormant state, and they will come back to life, so to speak, when they come into better conditions. But about half of them you're going to lose because they don't have a dormant or resting state. So instead of 10,000 and 5,000 bacteria and fungi respectively, you're down to 5,000 and 2,500. The best inoculants out there that we have probably have 5 or 10 in there. So even if you've lost a lot of them, you've still got great material. And you occasionally, I haven't found one that I really like for sure yet, although I know you look at them and I look at them both. There are some products that they call stabilized compost tea, where they force the microbes in there into a dormant state, either with concentrated molasses, phosphoric acid, there's a third thing.
Well, they just lower the pH till they go to an insisted stage, or they make it so that it's uncomfortable. Again, I use the word bugs a lot.
Yep.
And then when you add, especially alkali water here and things, it comes back up to where they will repopulate themselves to some degree. You're never going to have what's an aerated compost tea, but you'll be a lot better off. As a matter of fact, I've said for years, if you're going to use Garrett juice or my elixir or Bob's, if you think about it, mix it up the day before, at least a few hours before, let it get to the right temperature. And like I said, every 20 minutes or so, guys are going to start building again. So it's much better than just take it out the container and pour it. You'll get more good out of it.
Yes, ma'am.
Every year I go over to the mushroom farm and get compost. How's that? Is that or is there something?
Salt scares me a little bit. I don't know how they clean mushrooms or not. But that's
So
only
sterilize the bins, they use
Yeah.
table salt in effect.
Yeah, and so that'd be the only thing scary. And you can get a salt test. I don't know that there's anything bad. I like some mushroom compost, but I wouldn't use it exclusively.
And all sorts, your single source material. If you mix that in with some other compost sources, you're probably going to get a better material. Yes.
My compost is a minimalist approach. I throw all my stuff in a pile and it usually sits there and doesn't get turned in.
Mother Nature's been doing it for 3 billion
Static
years,
pile.
yeah.
Yeah.
Some way fungi business, not to turn, actually gives you fungus than turning it over. Because each time you keep rolling that compost, you're breaking the heck out of those fungi. Well, when you open mine, I've got where I've put all my cedar and things. If I carefully pick it up, I have a map.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a whole
wide-
city under there.
Yeah.
And so I don't turn that intentionally for
That's
that reason.
why I don't recommend or use the barrel composters. You read these things, you know, pay a bunch of money and you get this thing that you can sit there and crank, and it's a good exercise machine. But number one, you can't make enough compost to do much good. And number two, you're making 100% bacterial compost because you're totally destroying your fungi, turning it over that much. That's what in the composting business, they call it static pile. We think is the best method, where you let it sit for months before you turn it at all.
The reason they use windrows is they want to get volume out and sell you volume. But old Beck out there has been using the static pile for a long time. And if you've got enough patience, you're going to get some really good natural. What the answer is, what would Mother do? Mother Nature doesn't run around windrowing the world. She lets it lay there until it goes.
Question number?
Can you use too much compost?
Compost tea.
Can you use too much on it because too much of an application, the volume?
I figured I sure have never heard of it.
Might hurt the
Like
bank
you can't
account.
fertilizer, you know, you can over
Oh, no,
fertilize.
this, not to do, no, I guarantee you that I've used it straight out of the bucket. I might have too much. At Sandy's, we'll take one area, we'll have 20 gallons left. Stump the whole thing. Everybody just loves it. I mean, there's just not, it doesn't seem to be a
Stuff that we have left over on the weekends either goes into my garden or Roberta's garden, or it gets poured on plants around here.
Have you covered how this is different from beneficial management?
Whole different ballgame. We'll talk about that in a little while. Yeah. Question?
Yes, can you tell me exactly what we need to get from this?
Absolutely, and we'll come to that very shortly.
Oh, okay.
No, I can't tell you exactly because there's so many choices, but we'll give you a number of things. Yes, sir.
I need to make about 200 gallons of composting because that's my applicator.
Mhm.
Can I do that in the applicator?
No.
You got
Well-
air in there?
No, I can bring it up where I can get air in
Lots and lots and lots and lots of air.
it. You have lots, that has to have a lot of bubbles to it.
Yes, sir. And I would tend to say no, because in putting the compost in, you're putting in things that might clog up your spray rig, clog up your nozzles and things like that. I would tell you to make 25 gallons and then dilute it down with water.
How big an area do you want to cover? sir?
About 3 acres.
3 acres,
You need about 15 gallons of
15 or
compost
20
tea.
gallons of tea. Add whatever water it takes for you to spread that 20 gallons over that 3 acres. It's not a dilution, it is a carrier. and you'll have your 20 gallons or whatever it is on that 3 acre area from your 200 gallons pump. Matter of fact, that's about the right size.
Yeah.
That'd work.
5 gallons of tea per acre. If you're doing big areas, that's what we normally look at.
If on a compost pile and that, and I have cows and that, in the hay, and the hay doesn't have any
Good.
poisons.
No
Yeah.
picklorams, no
No,
2,4-Ds,
no.
okay.
And I pile it up. Can I just take and put some molasses in there to speed it up, any at all?
You'll make compost much faster that way. But you want to be very careful in adding molasses or something. That's one of the next things we're going to talk about is making your tea. Because it's easy to create too much life, which will cause it to go anaerobic. Because it's reproducing faster than you get oxygen into the water. Molasses in your compost pile is excellent. Molasses in your compost tea, just a tiny, tiny amount.
And we've even cut back on that. We used to do a little freer with it.
Yeah.
The more I've talked to Elaine, the more we found out a little goes a long way. It's the opposite of the American approach, where more is better.
But, yes,
On that pump and sprayer, you gotta watch what pump you're pumping through and what size strainer, because you'll
break up your
understand
fungi.
You'll kill what's in the tea trying to pump
You
it
won't
out.
kill the bacteria, but you will certainly do some damage to your fungi.
Is this a grass field too?
Is it,
Yes.
is it the same one like, say you spray with a continental belt sprayer? The screen in it?
That screen's probably not fine enough to
Okay.
really do a whole lot.
My other question was, we do big piles also. What's it good? We heat it up, and we turn it when it gets down to about 80 degrees. And I flip it over and start heating it up again.
Sure.
Is that like a good temperature to do it, or just let it drop all the way down?
What you're supposed to do is go to 135 degrees for 72 hours. When you start getting above 140 or so, you're starting, there's another set of microbes that come into thermophilics, I think they are,
Exactly.
and you're changing the, so I ideally like to get mine up to 130 or 40, then flip it back down, get it to 80 again when it gets back up to 100, and that's how we treated them at Garden Gun. That's why we had our thermometers. You can overheat them, I think. I think you lose some good guys if you're getting that thing up to, I mean, Malcolm Beck cooked turkeys in one several years ago. Yeah. He just wrapped the turkeys in tinfoil. They brought that sugar from the Coca-Cola factory and he poured it on there. It was over 165 degrees. Just wrapped them in tinfoil and buried them in the compost pile and ate them the next day. That's not good for compost, but it's damn good to cook turkeys.
But having that variation in temperature, yeah, what you're doing is probably fine, but try to keep it up warm for a while, then cool it off, then perhaps warm it up again.
Well, I try to keep it up like at 140 for
That's
as long
okay.
as possible.
Yeah.
And then it'll start dropping. Or I change the thermometer to another area, and dig down some.
Yeah.
Just
Stays
remember-
up or lower, you're okay.
You've got psychrophilic microbes that work in colder temperatures, mesophilic that work in the medium temperatures, thermophilic that work in higher temperatures. And you want a nice blend of all of those things. Now they're not obviously all of them are not going to be active at the same time because you've got 3 different big temperature ranges. But as the temperature goes up and down, you're going to put the guys back into a dormant state that don't like the temperature that it is. But having a bunch of them there that work at all the different temperatures is going to give you the greatest diversity of life in that tea, which is going to give you the best tea.
You know, we say we kill everything. They've actually taken dung and things out of pyramids and wet them, and the bugs were coming back to life. Some of them have a heck of a long cyst period before they go away.
Question behind us.
Back to spreading the compost tea, or
Uh-huh.
depending on whatever you call it. If you don't put it in a sprayer, how on earth are you going to cover any kind of decent sized area? I mean, I can't imagine using a watering can on my flower beds. That would be wasted.
If you're going to do it decent sized area, you probably want to use a sprayer of some sort.
So how do you, but then you're talking about destroying your fungi.
Let these folks come in that are outside.
no, you can-
They've requested to stay
Oh,
out.
okay.
Let me tell you.
They don't want to here with us?
They say they can hear.
I use a sump pump out of a 55-gallon barrel or a
Okay.
100-gallon, and it doesn't put out the most beautiful spray in the world, but I wet my tomato vines and everything down with it in some rich in the green, and I hope I'm not killing.
Is that a rotary? Well, how does that sump pull?
I don't,
You don't know?
I don't know how it's working.
Yeah.
I just hope that you let it.
Yeah, you've got a little impeller in there that's forcing it through. And yes, you're right. You know, you may be breaking up some of the fungi and things, but you know, you're 99% of what you're doing is good, 1% of what you're doing is bad. If I get 99% of anything right, it would be a record.
Well, I'm
So-
lazy.
Do what Malcolm Beck
That's what mine is.
Yeah.
I have a.
Has a big tank and he puts a little air pressure. I use those T-jets, the right size.
Yeah.
And I use under 20 pounds of pressure in an air tank. And I can do several acres with that.
Yeah.
So,
If you've got a tank that, you can pressurize, you can put your tea in there and then you just pressurize it, kind of same thing you do with a keg of beer, so that when you turn the tap it comes out, same way as spraying the compost tea out, and you're not breaking up your microbes that way.
I made mine from a 100-gallon or 150-gallon tank, a propane tank. I think I've got under $200, $150 for the valve. It's not quite as big as Malcolm's, it's about 100 gallons bigger than mine. But all I do is fill it up, now I hit more pressure. I go about 80 or 100 pounds, but then it'll do the whole tank. Now, Elaine says if you get over 135 pounds at a single source point, you can bust up some guys. But that's if you were spraying against a post at full force. When it's just coming through there and it's pressurized on top, I'm not sure it doesn't help keep the tea aerated. Because it's going to cause that tea and that oxygen to be forced into that water. So that's probably the best kind of system if you afford to get it.
Okay, one more question and we'll move along. Yes, ma'am?
You're going to talk about application for the home gardener who
Sure.
doesn't have.
Sure. Yeah.
That's more my thing.
Okay, let's talk about the actual process of making the compost tea. Obviously, the first thing you start with is water. Water's got some bad stuff in it when it comes out of the tap. Because those not the same microbes, but we're trying to put microbes in. The city's trying to kill all the microbes that are in there. So they use usually one of two things to put in the water to turn it into bad stuff for you. They either use chlorine or they use chloramine. I think Sauce is mostly still using chlorine now.
There's one area in North San Antonio, if you live up north towards Seguin, I guess that's called north.
Yeah.
They do have an area that's been chloramined because they were below standards at the well.
Yeah.
So if you live there, it'd be a little bit more important.
The nice thing about chlorine is that it goes away naturally on its own. It bubbles away. It
oxidizes.
Yeah.
It just oxidizes away. The oxygen that's there picks it up in basically a relatively short time, especially if you'll run your aerated for a few hours before you start making your tea and get that thing turned over. The chlorine will be gone. Unfortunately, chloramine doesn't go.
What we do is we put the water in the compost tea maker and turn on the oxygen, turn on the air, I should say, and it bubbles and it bubbles and it bubbles. And within a couple of hours, the great majority of the chlorine is out of there and gone. Certainly enough is gone that you can still make good compost tea. If you are in an area and they were putting chloramine in, which I hope they're not, because chloramine reacts with organic material to make some pretty carcinogenic compounds. I don't think they should be putting this in anybody's water. But if you've got an area where Bear Met, I think, are the ones that are using the chloramine, get some of the same drops that you put in a fish tank to take it out, and just put that into your water you're going to make your compost tea with. The first thing to do, like I say, is either get the chlorine or the chloramine out of it.
And consider, if you're only going to make for a home gardener, consider getting a rain barrel.
Yeah.
Collect 50, 55 gallons of water whenever you can, and that'll give you a good base. It really will. You don't have a problem, with chlorine, or fluoride. There's some good questions on what fluoride does to bugs.
Yes.
When you're using the drops here from the chlorine, you have to double the amount of the directions of the bottle. So you look in the belly and lost all the fish that I would use.
Use twice as much of the drops as they say on the bottle to get rid of the chloramine out of the water. Fortunately, it's not very expensive material.
moss and all in the rainwater.
Oh man, rainwater's the best stuff in the world.
I love rainwater. I got trouble using pond water.
Green algae in it, that's okay.
That's just fine. If it's growing good algae and good mosquitoes, it's probably good healthy water. And it's just a little extra protein source. Okay, what we're going to do next is we're going to take some sort of bag, and this is just a paint strainer's bag. Get them at any paint store or any
Lowe's
box
has them for
store,
sure.
anything like that. What are they, 50 cents, 75
Get
cents?
2 for $1 if you get the gallon. This is slightly larger.
Yeah.
These are 97 cents each.
We're going to put our compost in this. The reason we're putting it in here is because we want to be able to pull the compost back out after 6 or 8 hours. After having been in the bubbling water for that long, you're pretty much going to break free anything that's in there, and it's going to come out into the water We leave the compost in there, it just means we have to strain it that much more before we can spray it out. So
We used to throw it in the bottom of the bucket, but Elaine did some studies that even though you've got good aeration, there's pockets within there that are not getting aerated, and you get a mix of aerobic and anaerobics. This gives you more surface area and more control. When I go by my bucket, I tie a hole in the top, and I just shake the string every time I walk by, just to get things going for a while before I take it out. That way you're more in control of your inoculant than if you just got the bottom of the bucket.
And in the bucket that Bruce is going to show you in a little while that he makes, if he has one in the truck, which he probably does, or in ours, if you happen to look at it, it has two different air sources. The one down at the bottom that bubbles all the air up through the liquid, and a second one that you actually drop down in here that's bubbling air out into the bag all the time, that's tending to break those microbes free and being sure we don't have any pockets of anaerobic activity. So the next thing we do, we're putting, you know, 1.5 quarts or so of compost in here, sticking our air hose down in it and putting it down on the top of the tea maker, be it large, be it small, whatever. And we're going to let this go for 6 or 8 hours or so to break all the microbes free from the, you know, substrate, so to speak, and get them out in the water to where they can begin reproducing, hopefully at high rates.
You want it to look like, he mentioned earlier, but remember, we want a good boiling water. If you imagine what it looks like when you boil water on the stove, you don't want it so much it's splashing out, and you don't want so you can't see everywhere that water is roiling all the time. Somewhere in between there. There's actually such a thing as too small of a bubble, though you'd have to work at it. But for the most part, the air stones that I use, I'm not sure how the other systems work, put out bubbles that have got a lot of surface area, but they're not so small they're going to bust up your fungus. So that's kind of just happens to work pretty good for you. She's mentioned fish. I found out if the fish need the same thing as the aerobes, about 6 parts per million or so. And if you get much below that, you start losing some fish, except for tilapia. And if you start getting below that, you start losing some of your bugs. So it's kind of, if fish could live in it, you probably could grow bacteria.
Okay. So now we've got all this stuff that is in this water bath. And actually, I'll back up just a little bit. And about the same time we put the compost into the tea brewer, we're going to put something in there, or some things in there, to stimulate those microbes to reproduce. Now, it's gotten to be such a science as well as an art that nowadays some of the professionals are actually making what we refer to as designer compost teas. And
give it Neiman Marcus.
Yeah. But what this is for is if a farmer, rancher, homeowner, whatever, has a very specific problem in their land that they are trying to correct. If cottony root rot is a big problem in his field, or the melon growers, man, the melon growers have created horrible situations for themselves with some diseases they get in the soil that they simply can't get rid of. We're finding that by using different kinds of stimulants, and I don't know what all is used, but they can literally make a compost tea that will be extraordinarily effective in fighting a given insect or a given disease or a given problem. Just about anybody really gets into doing this and really gets proud of their tea and has good results, you know, they'll start getting their little recipe, and in their mind that's the only recipe to use, that's the only thing to put in there. We use a material that I have no idea what's actually in there. They just call it a catalyst, and they put a lot of different stuff in there. And then we'll usually jump in a little bit of fish hydrolysate right here. This stuff is real good for stimulating both bacteria and fungi. We may put in just a tiny little bit of molasses. If we want to create, well, we put some liquid seaweed in. Provides a lot of different things. If we want a tea that is more fungally dominated, we can use some things like oat bran or wheat germ, wheat bran, things like that. What all?
Oatmeal will work.
What all do you
fish
put
itself,
in?
fish has a tendency to be more.
I'm sorry.
Fish has a tendency to be more fungally dominated. Now, I have a friend, Jeff Monfeld. I'm going up. He's in Alaska. He's in Anchorage, and he's been doing a show there as long as Bob's been doing his. Don't hold it against him. He's actually a lawyer by trade.
Oh my gosh, we can't hold that against him, can we?
Yeah. But here's what he does. It's different. I know Bob's got a chance to read it. I think I give you a copy of his book.
Right, Teaming with Microbes.
He actually starts a fungal tea prior to starting his bacterial-based tea. He gets the fungus going, he gets his fungal-based compost, puts in his cornmeal or his bran or anything that has a tendency to hold and feed fungus first. 2 to 3 days in the book. I think he says like 3 days. He starts watching it with his microscope. You don't have to do this, but he's being more science about it at first. Then, at the end, when he sees these things starting to form, then he goes ahead and adds his little bit of molasses if he's going to. Goes ahead and adds what's going to be his base, his inoculant for bacteria, and then lets it go another 24 to 36 hours and uses that together. That gives him what he thinks and what is, looking at his scope pictures, a good balance of fungus and a good balance of bacteria. Now, we'll get into this a little bit. I'm sure Bob's got it on the list. What plants need what kind? Some people don't need, some plants don't need fungi as bad as others. Other plants are very much fungus dominated or preferred. And so what you make has a lot to do with where you're putting it. What are you going to grow? Think of.
Most of what we do, we kind of do a kind of a one-size-fits-all kind of deal. We make a basic compost tea that has plenty of bacteria, plenty of fungi in it. If you want to get into these designer type teas, talk to Bruce or somebody smarter than me, somebody who has researched it a lot, and there are people out there that do this. Another very commonly used material to add is material derived from worm castings. Bruce was mentioning that that is such a good thing to start with. There are actually some additional stimulants, some things that you will get by using worm castings, even if you just take worm castings and mix it in with your compost initially.
Well, worm is your best composter. I mean, he does all the work for you. He just spits it out the other end and you use it.
And then what do? We sit there and we let it brew. Like Bruce was saying, in some real specialty situations, you may brew with your fungal stimulants for 72 hours and then switch to bacterial. For the most part, if you're just using good compost to start with, you start it brewing, and 24 to 48 to maybe 72 hours, that's your optimum time, to be using it. And you want to be absolutely certain that you have that air bubbling through there the whole time that it's going. I mean, if you have power failure for an hour or two, you can run into real problems. But I'm not saying get a backup generator. But if we have a thunderstorm while you're brewing and the power goes out for a few hours, you may want to dump it and start over.
One thing that I do want to emphasize, we're saying it, when we say brew it for 24 more hours, you may only leave that bag in, especially in warm weather, 6 or 8 of those hours. Then you want to pull that bag out and let it just cook, brew, might be a better term without cooking there. Because you can't overdo that, and that makes you go anaerobic a lot quicker. So I take that out, I put it back in the compost pile. It's still got a lot of goodness in it. Throw it around your plants. I take my air stones back out then that were in the bag, and I put them into the tank, so now I've got 4 or 6 air stones running in the tank. I want as much air as I can, again, over bubbling the tank, and I usually can't do that below 5 pounds.
Question?
Yes, when you put compost teas on plants and stuff, how much put on, just to get them wet or slightly wet or?
If you're wanting to apply it to the foliage, just enough to wet the foliage. If you're wanting to, treat the ground, as much as you want to soak it, as much as you can.
You want to get to the underside of those leaves.
Yeah, straight top and bottom.
The stomata are open, it gets the goodness in it early in the day, and underneath if you can, as well as on top, and you'll get a lot more goodness out.
Why don't I take just a second and show a couple of kinds of sprayers? Why don't you run see if you've got a tea bucket in your truck, and we'll show you a very basic. When we did the seminar up in Austin with Dr. Ingham, we did what she called a tea off or a brew off, and about a dozen people, maybe 15 people, brought their own compost tea makers, and we kind of had a contest as to who would make the best tea. And then the next day we all got our microscopes out, and she taught us how to analyze the tea and figure out which was the best tea, which produces the greatest diversity of microbes and the greatest number of microbes. The #1 tea that was produced that weekend, or that week actually, was Malcolm Beck's little machine that cost, I don't know, $12,000, $15,000, something like that, his worm gold machine. And that she rated as the very best tea that was produced. #2 out of 12 or 15 tea makers was Bruce's bucket, which I hope he has one of in his truck that he's going to show you, that the sum amount of materials used in making that bucket was about $25. So the point here is you don't have to buy a really fancy machine in order to make compost tea. The one we use costs about $1,800. That's basically why we charge for the tea. It doesn't cost very much to make the tea, but it takes a while to pay for that machine. But you can buy these things in all different sizes. If you're just doing this for home use, I don't think you ever need more than 5 gallons of tea. If you're applying it to acreage, yeah, you probably want a machine that makes bigger batches of tea at one time. Yes, sir.
That button is on your website.
It is on his website, but it's easier to see in person. Yes, sir.
Using that one, have the 5 gallon bucket.
Uh-huh.
Except for the sediment in the bottom, I've been applying it full strength and I can't pump it very
That's fine.
problem.
That's fine. No problem whatsoever. It just goes further if you dilute it with water. One advantage to applying it full strength is, you know, when you stop and think about it, if you're using a hose-in sprayer, which most of us end up using, yeah, little chai all over it, that chlorinated water that you're forcing through here is going to do some damage to the microbes because there's no way that you can very effectively, you know, dechlorinate the water that you're now putting through your sprayer. Typically, again, so it kills off half the life in your compost tea. You still got an awful lot of good stuff out there. And so, yes, you can use this type of sprayer, but the ideal sprayer would be a sprayer that takes fully diluted material. And this is just, you know, the simplest little thing, these little pump-up sprayers that, depending on the size you get, hold from, what is this, 1.5 gallon? This is 1 gallon size. The biggest one is like a 2 gallon size. You don't want to go much bigger than that because it gets too heavy to lug around. But putting it on without diluting it, or diluting it with rainwater or something like that so you're not killing a lot of the microbes off, would definitely be a good idea. But again, that's just not always practical in the home yard. So you end up using hose-in sprayers and things like that, and sure, you're going to kill off some of the microbes, probably not too many. Well, it depends on how big your yard is. And for foliar spraying, this kind of sprayer is very practical. Yes, sir.
I pull it around in a bag and that's a big tank.
That works fine. Yes, sir.
If you increase the volume, you've been brewing at 5 gallons at a time, you increase to 10 or 15 gallons, can you just multiply the ingredients?
Absolutely.
For 5 without
Absolutely.
the air? Do you need to add more stone?
You would need a bigger air stone, or you need a bigger air pump, because, well, you would have more air stones then, yes, because you're trying to maintain the highest possible level of dissolved oxygen in there. Things that you're looking at here, that strand running right across there, that is one of the beneficial fungi. These guys are little, probably dinoflagellates of some sort, the little protozoans. It's hard to see just on a picture, a micrograph like this, but all those little specks, if you were looking at them through the microscope, they'd be moving around and vibrating like mad, and some of you'd actually see moving. The diversity of microbes that you get in compost tea is just fascinating. And of course, my training, I'm an old research biologist, spent a lot of time looking through microscopes in my college days. So this is just an interesting thing to do. But like Bruce said, you don't have to have a microscope, you know, to make good compost tea. And at least in the slower season, if you're making your compost tea and you want it evaluated sometime, bring by sometime when we've got our scope out and set up, and be happy to look at it and tell you, you know, whether it's good or bad or otherwise. I don't see the gentleman who came a lot last year. He brought us a sample of his homemade tea. I was very embarrassed to say his was a whole lot better than what we were making. And then he gave us his series of steps that he went through, and it was amazing what he went through to make good tea. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm sorry I was late, but did you talk about how much you want to dilute the compost tea?
The water is strictly a carrier. In large applications, we figure about 5 gallons per acre, which means the average yard at home, probably about a gallon of compost tea. Bruce, I'm going to turn these things off because I think it's warm enough in here, and that way we won't. Okay. It makes no difference. It makes no difference. Just you're just mixing and spraying. I would have it set fairly wide open. So you're getting more tea and less city water mixed with it. Yes.
putting in there, like a 5 gallon?
Probably half a teaspoon, yeah, of molasses. Seaweed, maybe a tablespoon.
Is this in what size?
5 gallon.
Remember, very temperature dependent. They're gonna really go nuts. As a matter of fact, Elaine taught us that at 106 degrees, you can't put enough oxygen in the water to make compost tea. So you wanna keep your buckets in the shade, especially in the summer. You can get too cool for it to be very active, but it doesn't chill it, it just slows it down. But you can get so hot, you gotta have 6 parts per million or so of oxygen, and water at 106 degrees can't hold that much oxygen. That's why you see these places turn over once in a while where the sun hits them and all the fish die. Run out of oxygen.
What's the ideal temperature, did you say?
Well, if there's any one ideal temperature, I try to keep my bucket about 75 to 80 degrees. There probably is an exact peak, but again, that very much depends on what the bacteria is, how much food did you give them. Fungi is going to be different than bacteria. But yeah, in general, whatever's comfortable for you. If it's too cold for you, it's too cold for the
What
bucket.
about the compost on that 15 gallons? How much compost would I have to use for that 15 gallons?
15 gallons, what, a couple of quarts?
Yeah, a couple of, maybe, yeah, 2.5 quarts, 3 quarts.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Did you tell us your website?
Mine? Sure. Natureapproved.net is the easiest one to get to. And let me tell Bob so I can brag a minute. As of yesterday, we were picked up by iTunes. So if anybody's got an MP3 or anything, all my shows will be on iTunes everywhere from now on. So it'd be kind of fun to go get it. You can click them down from my site. I think Howard Garrett's going to put them on here. You'll be able to get them whenever you want them.
And after the seminar, I'll ask him what that means for us low-tech guys.
Yeah.
that-
I bet they know.
Yeah.
.net or .com?
It's a .net, that way.
This is Bruce's tea bucket.
Folks, there's $25 worth of stuff here if you don't shop. I'll show them to you. These all come from, I'm going to give Wally World a push. They used to have everything that seems to work. Everything you're holding here, this don't even cost anymore. And these have to go from somewhere else. These guys are $1 or so each. Air stones. Oh, I guess I always forget.
Let's pass them around.
I thought everybody had fish. The pump that I have been using, folks, is awfully inexpensive. If you can spend a little more and get a bigger one, it won't hurt. But this has the magic of dual outlets, so you can run one end of the bucket and one end of the bag. Okay, and then when you get through, throw them both in the bucket. And this, I think, is $9.95. The biggest price, $10 aquarium pump. I've gone to a slightly bigger one just because I could get them, but I almost have to turn it down a little bit. So it's not much of a.
What's the gallon rating on the pump?
Oh yeah, that's what you want to know. This is rated 20 to 60 gallons. I don't know where it is, but it is. Yeah, and that's about the right size. 50 or 60 gallon is way. You think, well, that's too much. No, it's not, because in the aquarium, all you're doing is moving the. They use it to run the filters under the soil. I mean, under the gravel and everything. We want to really get this thing bubbling, like again, a boiling pot.
So visualize, you've got 2 tubes coming off of this. You've got an air stone on each tube.
I cut this in 4 pieces. I run them from here. I run them to the little air stones with these splitters. Again, this has all got a book on the thing. And then the little guys.
98 cents.
Yeah, 98 cents. The little guys go on each end of that on the splitter. The bigger guys go in the bottom of the tank. I'm always playing with it. Right now I try to make them even as I can. Other people that use mine put all the air stones in the bottom ones on one side and let the water roll. I'm not sure which is most effective. I get good tea. And this again is $25 if you make your own, about $50 if you go buy it somewhere, just because we're going to pay somebody to put them together.
If you've got a lot of foaming going on in your bucket, you can add a little bit of oil to cut down on that, but don't use olive oil, much as we love olives. Olive oil has a natural antibacterial component to it, so we don't use olive oil to cut down on the foaming, but just about any other kind of cooking oil, just a few drops, into your bucket will really cut down on the foam buildup.
These are the littler bags. These are the ones you get 2 for 97 cents. This is about the size I use in this size of bucket. Very inexpensive, yes.
Have you had any experience with wands? They're flexible tubes that kind of mimic.
I've played with the air ones. The ones I got didn't work for me well, but I understand they were also very cheap. I've also gone now to a pump company that makes air stones as big as golf balls or a little bigger. And I'm going to play with those for the next. I've built a 15-gallon now. And I want to make sure I get enough air in it. And if I do, I'll teach you all how. I'll throw that on the web.
Can I use polypropylene cornstarch in a bigger container?
Use what now?
Well, you know, the woven polypropylene
Yeah.
bags.
But yeah,
I used all the old pillowcases I was.
you see, let me tell you what part of the problem is. My favorite thing to play with is pantyhose. Since my wife found them in the car, no, but we discovered, or at least Elaine told me, that they're too fine. If you filter through them, or you put it in there, at least for fungi, they need to have I think she gave me like 200 thread per inch for those that do cloth, and that the pantyhose is too close. So I would guess that also pillowcases might be a little too close for fungal. You want a decent size hole in here. These seem to have worked out pretty well when we measured them, if I remember. So pantyhose is a little too fine. I would guess that your pillowcase is a little too fine. You want a little bit bigger hole than that. And you can always restrain these things. I pour back through this, or if you really want to strain them clear, you can actually make several folds of cheesecloth. Pour it through the cheesecloth. If it's starting to suck up your, okay, but remember, the more you filter it, the less fungi you're going to get if it gets too fine. Yes, ma'am.
So how much compost do you use in that size?
Well, I hate to do this to you. A couple of big hands full.
Cup and a half. If you need to be scientific, exactly 1.5 cups.
I never have done it twice the same, so it's hard for me to tell you. And the truth is, that's intentional. I really don't think that the exact same formula over and over and over is necessarily the best. I go get dirt from here sometime, and I use llama poo one time and chicken manure the next, and compost it.
Making compost tea is both an art and a science. The art comes into playing with all the different stuff you put in. The science comes from knowing which stimulant will, enhance a particular thing that you want to increase in your compost tea. So there's a lot you learn after having done it for a little while.
Elaine has some good books, but they're expensive. But this guy, Teaming with Microbes, is available from TOFGA, read my head.
Texas Organic Farmers and Gardeners Association.
And they have it at regular price. It's not very expensive. And as far as a little book that really gets you started and has some nice formulas and things, Teaming with Microbes is a winner.
Your question.
I didn't get his
NatureApproved.net.
And this gentleman, yes, sir?
You have holes in your bucket. Did you keep the lid on the bucket?
Yes, sir. I put this on. I didn't used to have a lid. And I had losing compost tea. There's my doggy around. and so I started doing it, and now I run that thread through there and hold this, and I can jiggle it up and down, and I can support this so it's not touching the bottom, so I'm getting more surface area.
Where do you get the Teaming with Microbes?
Teaming with Microbes?
Hairs on the side just to run them out so I can set the pump on top and be lazy.
Okay.
And so that my dog's name's Secret, and Secret won't drink anymore.
So if I have a bunch of these buckets without lids, they'll still work just fine?
Oh, sure, if you don't have a dog.
He was talking about using worm casting. We have a worm bed for fishing worms.
Yes.
Do you just take the dirt out of that? Is that
That's
what you do?
plenty good enough. Yeah, if you want to capture it, I can teach you how to get the worms away and get the stuff, but it's not, you're going to have some good stuff if you've got a real concentrated
Just
worm.
take something.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm lazy too. Where do I buy the bucket assembled?
Well, they have them here, always one or two. This is yours.
No, we don't have any. Oh, is this ours?
This is yours.
Oh, okay. Ask Wendy. If you want to know, ask Wendy.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah.
And you can call or just write me at either natureapproved.net or natureapproved@yahoo.com and tell me, and I'll leave it somewhere you can pick it up or get you one. I'd rather you make them just because I'm lazy, but I'll certainly do that. There's a matter of cast them down. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. My neighbor's at home, he couldn't see the setup there.
Oh, shit.
There's 2 large air stones at the bottom and then 2 small stones in the bag with the
Is he a computer operator at all?
compost.
He's not. Because you can go to your website, my website, and I got 11 pages with picture on each page exactly how to build this thing that even I can understand.
I have a question, but it's kind of off the subject. You know, I have a garden, and I like to get some worms in. Where can I get worms?
You can order them from 3 dozen places. If you happen to have a website, you have a computer, Google worms.
Okay.
You're going to have 5 million hits. There's some worms better than others. The red worms that you get that we use are for garbage. are not very good in your garden because they die. They don't fit you. You need to get a worm that was this is acclimated to you, and you can do that. You have to go fishing a little bit. And then the new thing I'm working with, now Bob and I have discussed this, I now am supporting army flies. The gray fly, the little black fly that comes in, and you used to hate it when you were growing your worms. They've done some study. First, they break things down 10 times faster than earthworms. And there's actually some unique stuff that they put out that the worm doesn't, so you get a mixture of both. And here we go again with what? More diversity. So I'm actually raising soldier flies this year. And it's going to be very interesting. Yes?
How do you clean your compost tea maker?
I use peroxide. I don't like bleach. I use hydrogen peroxide. It's 29 cents a bottle. I gargle with it, brush my teeth with it, and clean my machine.
Is it a good idea when you till the garden to put some of this in and till it in? Or?
If you're going to till, I don't till.
Oh, you don't
I'm
need
a no-till
to once
guy.
it gets into the
I broke off my Austrian peas last week. I scratched them up a little bit. Next week or week after, I'm going to plant them.
The problem with tillage is you bring up weed seeds that have been lying there maybe for 50 years. Every time you till your garden, you get a whole new crop of weeds. The second disadvantage to tillage is you're putting organic material up on the surface where it can oxidize and just be destroyed by air. The less you till your garden, the fewer weeds you'll have and the healthier your soil will be.
The Indians used to ask the white men why they turned the earth over. They didn't understand
And the
why
answer,
we
of course,
tilled the
is so we
soil.
can sell rototillers. That's the real reason that we turn the
mantis
earth over.
loves this.
Yeah, absolutely. No, the less tillage you do, the better off your soil is, the better off you are.
When do you put the best time to put this down? A couple times
Early
a year?
in the morning, first. Earlier the better.
Okay.
And I use it myself every month or 5, whenever I feel like making it. I don't know that you have to do that much, 3 or 4 times a year may be adequate. But I do it because I'm experimenting all the time.
On the
I'm always
plants,
trying
at the
something.
base of the plants, or all the dirt, or
It's great to
Everywhere you
foliar
put it.
feed, which means spray the plants, but it's also occasionally good, especially to drench. If you've been using synthetics, petroleum-based fertilizer, I like to drench the soil and try to give it a little extra bug.
And if the worst happens, your neighbor comes over and sprays something nasty on your yard or sprays something nasty on his yard and it's drifting over the fence, or you get one of these idiot pest control companies. One of the girls that used to work with us lived up at Canyon Lake and came home to find a big sign in her yard saying, "Thank you for letting True Green," or whoever it was, "treat your yard today." She said, "I didn't ask you to come in and treat my yard." Well, apparently to work for them, you don't have to be able to read house numbers, and they were supposed to have treated the yard across the street. So now she's got a yard full of poisons of all sorts. This is the kind of thing that denatures and breaks down that sort of thing, and if you are in a toxic situation, I don't know anything that will work to remedy that more quickly than compost tea application.
on the lawn or anything.
Or anything, yeah.
Can I give you my lazy man's way of spreading it?
Yeah.
You sell the little siphoners you put on the end of the hose with the little tube going in.
Right there,
My
yeah.
5-gallon bucket, I pour it through the siphoner to get all the big material. And I just put that in the bottom of the 5-gallon bucket.
Works great.
Put an oscillating sprinkler on and carry on when it covers.
As long as you're not creating a lot of back pressure in the hose, that'll work fine. But if you have a sprinkler that really builds up pressure, that will keep these things from working. But in most cases, those little oscillating, water wasting things are very good for putting that sort of thing
There's a
out.
company called Easy Flow that has one you can put in line with your hose at full pressure. And it'll either do a drip system or a full sprinkler and not lose anything.
But remember that the more of that city water you're using, the more chlorine and chloramine is working against your microbes.
I
So
keep forgetting that.
try to put out as much tea with as little water as possible to have the very best effect.
If you're a city dweller.
Unless you haven't asked yet, we'll let you have the next question.
Back to the tilling, I'm sorry to backtrack. If you don't till, we've got this clay soil. How do I,
Create microbial life. Put on compost tea, put on Medina Plus, and best of all, just put raw compost out on the
You got
yard.
it.
compost?
The example that I will give you of that is, this was quite a few years ago. It was early fall. The soil in my garden was so hard, I mean, it had been a very dry summer and fall, that I had trouble breaking it with a digging bar. I knew I was going to plant some fruit trees come January, so I got a load of good compost. And everywhere I was going to put a tree, I put 3 wheelbarrow fulls of compost, just dumped in a pile on the ground. Was still a fairly dry fall, but I put a little water on those piles every now and then. January, when my fruit trees came in, you could dig that soil with a spoon. It was so soft underneath. The surrounding soil was still as hard as adobe. So, yeah, building the organic content of the soil, flocculating the soil, that's what gives you soft soil. You know, and you start tilling under the right situation or the wrong situation, it'll be just as hard a week later as it was when you started. So, doing it naturally through building organic material and oxygen and biological life in the soil, you will soften your soil to where you never have hard soil again. But it won't happen overnight. Yes.
If you were gonna do 100 acres of sand to build up that organic material, what would you do?
I'd move. I'm already working with Sandy Oaks out in Elmendorf, and it really is a big problem to get OM or Getter back into blow sand.
I'm just south of Seguin, and we're in the sand hills there, and it's a big
We've been
problem.
buying complete semi-loads of composted chicken manure. This is the 3rd year. And I'm not sure we're seeing a lot of organic matter yet.
Well, I did have a ton to the acre, a ton and a half to the acre of chicken manure put down on about 40 acres this year.
Wow.
Now, I would suggest that you start spraying 4 or 5 times a year with molasses, 5 gallons per acre, because molasses is the best bacterial stimulant that you can buy easily. If you happen to have the connections that Malcolm Beck does, he got with the Coca-Cola company. Coca-Cola was paying Saws a huge amount of money to be allowed to dump their old product down the drain. And Malcolm said, well, I'll not only not charge you to put it on my compost pile, I'll give you $5 a truckload or some ridiculously small amount. And he created just an incredible amount of biological activity. I recommend the molasses because if you get with somebody that, you know, puts molasses in lick feeders, I use Skylar Kep up in New Braunfels. He filled my feeder week before last, $1.30 a gallon. That's pretty cheap.
And 5 or 6 gallons an acre, they recommend sometimes less, but at least our friend Betsy Ross
Well, in the past, I have
uses
done
5 or 6 gallons an acre.
the molasses and the Medina Plus together.
It should help.
But I wasn't regular about it. It was hit and miss.
If you've got that much sand, it's tough to get organic matter.
How do you dilute the molasses for distribution?
Same as
I mean, what ratio do you use?
You figure out how much your sprayer will do. My sprayer takes about between 15 and 20 gallons of liquid to cover an acre. So I'm going to use 5 gallons of molasses, 15 gallons of water.
Will it go through that?
Oh yeah,
Get thin
oh
enough?
yeah, it gets thin enough. I use continental.
Remember, it's back to the other thing we mentioned. The water is just a carrier. So if I say to you, put 5 gallons on an acre, if you have to get 50 gallons, because that's what you've got, it'll still go on that acre. And it'll actually spread out and get into the soil a little better.
Back to your pure sand that you're trying to improve, if you can do it. The other thing to do is to plant a good cover crop, and especially in the cool months, get Douglas King seed, get one of the vetches, get Austrian winter peas, get any kind of legume that you can, and just leave it on the surface of the ground as a green manure. Be sure you inoculate your legume, then you've got bacteria in the soil that are taking nitrogen from the air and converting it into a form that more microbes are going to use. And I think for probably, 3 or 4 years growing a cover crop, you'll increase your organic content probably by at least 0.5% per year.
Clover will work?
Clover is fine. Clover is fine.
I plant 20 acres in Urana, white clover this year.
White clover.
Yeah.
And I just spent 6 hours with Gene Solik on Wednesday, Thursday.
Yeah.
Sure.
For a little field day that he did for some Texas A&M class.
HRM things.
And it's amazing what he's done, and his is all clover based.
Yeah. And he's in a little bit higher rain belt
Right.
than most of us are. But yeah, that man runs 1 cow per acre or something like that. And fascinating
And
guy.
he told me he made $750 per acre this past year.
Yeah.
Can I use agriculture molasses, or do I use table grade in my?
Whatever's cheapest.
You can afford it, but it's a lot cheaper to
Well,
get
I
ag.
still will not to use that.
By somebody wanting to sell you table molasses?
Well, no, I think my son-in-law came up with this, that we use Spain table molasses instead of what they sell at the nursery. Can I go back to that?
Go back to the cheapest
So
molasses
it's
you
gonna be a
can
lot more
find.
money, I'm gonna guess, but it's
Yeah.
certainly okay.
Well, I licked the lid.
I tell you the only thing yeah, you can eat and spread it at the same time. But I tell you one thing you do have to be careful of, and I learned this, Bob and I discussed it. At the end of the season, for several years, I was buying the deer molasses. When they're left at these big box stores, they sell them to you for $1 a gallon. It's full of fungicide. You want to read that thing and make sure they haven't put a fungicide in the molasses to stunt the growth of fungus and molds. So be sure you don't have that in your molasses. Other than that, any of it will do.
Talking to Stuart Monday or Tuesday down in Hondo, but I didn't ask him this. Does this compost tea take any place of soil activator or not?
Couple things. Compost tea, what you get out of compost tea is life. You're getting the microbes. Medina Plus doesn't have, or soil activator, this is your soil activator with seaweed added to it, doesn't have any life in it, but it's full of things that stimulate the life. The two of them in combination will be a great thing to do.
That's what I'm using.
But, yeah.
Bob?
What color is Medina Plus? It varies. It depends on exactly, how stinky the stuff that he put into it was. I've seen it come out light brown. I've seen it come out almost clear.
I have to.
But it varies in color. So okay, I'll tell him to
Add a teaspoon of molasses.
That'll make it even better, by the way. Yeah.
How about dry molasses in the bag? For a yard, I'm just talking about a yard.
To put on your yard, excellent stuff. Outstanding stuff if you can afford it. Dry molasses, of course, is not crystalline molasses. Some people think I'm going to take dry molasses and dissolve it. The guy that sold me my Continental Belton sprayer dumped 200 pounds of dry molasses into his own sprayer and took him 4 days of constant work to get it unclogged after he got through with it. Dry molasses does not dissolve. Dry molasses is either chopped up cane or soy or something like that that's had molasses sprayed on it. So don't try to dissolve it, but you can put it on dry onto a yard, and it's a very good thing to do. Once again,
Howard says it's synergistic. It's on a lot of organic material like rice hulls or wheat whey, and he actually is convinced himself, at least, that you get more bang for your buck with dry. I personally think pure liquid molasses, if you can handle it properly, is going to give you way more bang for your dollar.
Yeah, I think Howard's getting kickback or something on that.
Yeah, he was telling me that, but I saw his picture on the bag.
So where do you buy the liquid molasses? At a feed store?
At a feed store is by far the least expensive way. Now, most of the nurseries have it, but they got to charge more because they're not buying 5,000 gallons at a time. See,
And if you find a feed store that is formulating their own feed, this is not some guy that just set up a shingle and started selling full of pet feed. It's a big feed store. It's a who are the guys in Comfort?
Comfort's Lintner Feeds.
Yeah, Lintner Feeds.
There's one in Lubbock. I mean in Lukenbach. There's one in Fredericksburg. There's.
You can't really go in there and buy like a gallon.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah, you can. They'll usually let you go. I usually get 5 gallons, but they just drain it off. I bet there's somebody in Quail.
Take your own jug, and then they're a whole lot more willing to sell.
We got some 20 gallon. We got some big.
Yeah, that's cool. Usually they'll fill those.
Take your gallon with you and say, bake something and take with you and say, I just took these out of the oven. By the way, I'd like to buy a gallon of molasses. They get a lot nicer like that. Or take some good produce. There used to be a restaurant in Bernie where I could go in with a bag of squash and stuff like that and get a free meal just by taking a fresh produce. Anybody that's ever grown squash, I had somebody in one of the little communities telling me is the only time we lock our houses and our cars is during squash season. Otherwise, neighbors are likely to fill it up. Somebody said, we're related, you have to take zucchini. Anyway, take some fresh produce and you'll be amazed how much nicer they get.
Some of that, their dispenser on that liquid molasses, the nozzle is so large they can't, they'd have to get a funnel and all, but if you take a 5-gallon bucket, there's no problem at all.
That's what I do.
Some of them, the nozzles are quite large.
Yeah, well, that was the problem.
We'll take a 5-gallon bucket.
Oh,
you can buy 5 gallons of molasses.
They gave us a 30-gallon drum for free, so it was
Okay. And you can buy 5 gallons there cheaper than you can buy a gallon from a nursery, including us, because we pay a fortune for it. Yes, sir.
Does Dina sell molasses in like 50-gallon drums?
I don't know, they put it in gallon containers and quart containers. I don't know if they sell it in drums, but I wouldn't buy it from them. They're not a feed producer, and they're not, you ought to buy it from whoever they buy it from.
Who around Castroville, Honda?
Oh, go right there to Mummy's, the actual factory right there. They mix all their own foods just outside of Hondo there. What's his name? Jesus, Jesse Lopez, is the manager there.
What's the next one about urea? It seemed to me like the last time I bought it.
They do add
Seemed a
urea,
little
well,
higher.
it's for protein. They're doing that more for feed, and I've never seen it high enough I'd be afraid of it all. Remember how much you're diluting?
I was,
Yeah,
it was like
it's a few
14%.
percent, it's good, but by the time you put that in 2 ounces to the gallon, you've got a piece of a percentage of urea.
And you've also got a great nitrogen source.
Oh, yes, as much as we don't talk about wanting, in that particular case, that's cheap nitrogen. Really is.
Bruce?
Yes.
Or Bob, what would be the frequency on spraying those fields? I'm not haying or anything, just grazing. How often would you spray that?
In your lousy soil, you could do it once a month. Somebody that's got decent soil, 2-3 times a year.
That's for the molasses or compost?
Yeah.
Either.
Either one.
Oh, okay, that's what I want to know, how often you spray the composting.
Again, I use mine every month or 6 weeks because I'm always making something new, but I think I probably overdo it.
I do it once a week if we have any left over here at the
So
nursery.
he does it a lot,
Yeah.
more than I do.
Compost tea,
What pH is my water?
I buy from a guy named Skylar Kep. Kep Liquid Feeds, K-O-E-P-P.
Yes. Most of us have neutral to slightly alkali waters here. Most of the put-to-sleep teas are very low in pH.
He is on Hunter Road.
That's fine.
I have no
That's
idea
a
where
little
that is.
above,
I mailed him a check
neutral.
yesterday, so I
Yeah. That's correct, that's what I have. And
called
mine's
him.
about 8.
I have no idea. He's a nice guy.
Yes.
Use distilled water to keep the microbes from dying.
No, as a matter of fact, that's an interesting question. It's not as good. They need the minerals and they need the natural stuff in the water. And Elaine actually did some studies with the distilled water. They don't have any like that.
You break the
Probably not
cactus loose on the
dangerous, but it
ground,
just doesn't.
and then just spray it with concentrated molasses, it just makes it rot so fast, it doesn't have time.
Well, again, the chlorine will come out.
Bruce and I will stay here and answer questions. Those of y'all that need to go, you're not embarrassing us if you get up and leave. We thank you very much for coming, and we'll do something fun again next week. I don't even know what the next seminar is. Anytime something appears to be stressed is when I think it really does work wonders. It's kind of like a vitamin supplement. It's never going to hurt anything. It hurts when you look at the price of it, especially if you buy it by the quart like I do. But it's never going to hurt anything. But if you've ever got plants that are stressed or shocky for any reason, if you got plants with root problems, spray it on the foliage because the roots are damaged and can't take it up. Otherwise, just use it as a drench on the pots and things. My friends, the Fanick boys, Mark and Mike, bring a lot of all the burlap mountain laurels and put them in pots. He told me they used to lose about 40% of them. Mountain laurels are tough to transplant. He said about 40% of them would die. Got them to mixing this up and soaking the plants when they transplant them. Saw Mike the other day, he said nowadays they lose about 1 out of 100 trees. And so this stuff is wonderful. But sometime, I'll make Patrick save a box sometime and bring it out and let you read it. The cornerstone of thousands of successful nurseries. Report any insult to your intelligence by products claiming to be like Super Thrive. There is nothing like Super Thrive. Anyway.